Chapter 19, Cattle and Cotton. Of course, in Texas, most Texans realize that we have a large ranching tradition. That ranching tradition includes, of course, the very popularized idea of cattle drives here in Texas. But actually, large-scale cattle drives began after the Civil War. There had been cattle drives in Texas before. In fact, of course, when the Spanish arrive here in Texas, they bring their animals with them, of course, including pigs and cattle. And during the Spanish period, in order to feed the missions, the people that worked in the missions and the Indians that came to the missions, cattle were often raised in and around mission grounds. Vaqueros became the first cowboys of Texas. These Spaniards who drove and raised and handled cattle. In fact, at least one of the missions had about 50,000 cattle that it raised on a regular basis in order to feed and help populate the area around the mission. During the American Revolutionary War in the 1770s, early 1780s, the Spanish drove cows to New Orleans and then floated those cows on rafts up the Mississippi River to help feed American forces that were fighting in what we now know as Illinois. The California Gold Rush also gave a reason for Texans to drive cattle the other direction towards the west. Of course, the influx of people in California meant that what had been a very low European population, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 Spaniards, quickly within a year or so transformed it into over 100,000 people, and all those people needed food. And so Texans realized that there's a way to make money by driving the cows from Texas to California. But the large-scale cattle drives are really in our minds, the ones that are generally portrayed in the movies, for example, occur after the Civil War in order to make profits, in order to make money. The cattle trails went north to the railroads. Oh, Texas cattle had been driven, by the way, from Texas, then through northern Arkansas, through Missouri, to Illinois before. However, these Texas cows, the longhorns especially, carried ticks that produced what was often called times Texas fever in other animals along the way, and Missouri became very reluctant. Missourians actually became very hostile towards Texas cattle being driven through Missouri, and the idea that maybe that the railroads that had run to Missouri might be expanded through Missouri out west through Kansas. That would give Texas a way to drive their cattle to the railroad heads and then load those cattle on the railroads, on the railroad cars, and ship them to the East Coast cities like New York and Philadelphia and other cities that were experiencing a population boom and needed meat supply. So the railroad agreed to build basically a road stretching into Kansas, and Texans basically reacted by driving the cows from Texas north to what we now know as places like Dodge City, for example, and Abilene, Kansas, made famous in many cowboy movies. There were many cattle trails headed north. Perhaps the most famous was the Chisholm Trail. Of course, generally these trails were named after a large cattle rancher that were been driving their cattle up for a number of years. The Goodnight Loving Trail, another important trail in Texas, the Western Trail, basically because it was west of the Chisholm Trail. So eventually, for example, on the Chisholm Trail and the other trails from 1867, from in the Civil War to about 1884, over 5 million cows were taken from Texas and driven to the railheads in Kansas to be placed on railroad cars to be shipped for food to areas along the East Coast. Eventually, of course, the trails, the first again, major trail was the Chisholm Trail, but eventually that trail went through Indian lands, and the Indians started charging fees for the cows to be driven through that area. Then also, as time progressed, people started building ranches and farms near the trail, and that meant the cow drives would often endanger the farms and the other ranches, and which is one reason they shifted to the Western Trail, so that cow drives from Texas could continue. Of course, after the Civil War, in Texas, you had a large population that was without jobs. Again, not much physical damage here in Texas due to the Civil War, but there's a lot of social and economic damage and reconstruction that needed to take place here in Texas. So you had a lot of people that didn't have a job. Of course, you had the newly freed slaves, and they needed jobs. So these cattle drives offered ways to give jobs to people who often did not have them, especially the men. Eventually, probably about 1 out of every 4 cowboys was an African American. Of course, there were also Hispanic cowboys and Anglo cowboys, and even a few cowgirls along the trails. They came from many different backgrounds, many different nationalities. Of course, we had a large German population and German descendant population here in Texas, along with some French and some Czech and some other European populations as well. Most of these cowboys were young and unmarried. Obviously, it was going to take a while to move the cows from place to place, so if you were married, you didn't want to be gone from your family for very long. So it was really not a job for a married person, and because the conditions were so harsh on the trail, it really wasn't a job for an older person either. Of course, these cowboys or drivers didn't work in the winters months because basically the cattle drives took place in the spring and summer. The pay was actually not that great, but of course, besides the pay as a cowboy, you also got fed along the way. Probably took about a crew of 10 to 12 to move about 2,000 cattle. The trail boss now made about $100 a month at the time, however, a typical drover or what we might consider a cowboy only made about $30 a month, so it wasn't the greatest pay. But especially if you like to be outdoors, it was a good job, because again, from the spring through the fall, basically cattle drives about 10 miles a day, and depending upon where you're leaving from Texas and where you're going to Kansas, it take anywhere from 25 to 100 days to drive those cows to that area. And there were a lot of, again, profits to be made here in Texas, especially after the Civil War. You could probably pick out cows for free, although theoretically they cost you about $1 or $2 to actually purchase, I guess, here in Texas. Actually, driving the cow from Texas to Kansas actually only costs $1 per cow. So if you bought one at $1 and you drove it to Kansas for another $1, that's $2. But depending upon the year, you could sell your cow in Dodge City or Abilene or wherever anywhere from $40 to $60 a cow, which means the cattle owner was going to be making a lot of money. So cattle drives, especially in the movies, seem to go on for a long time in U.S. history, but actually they were it's a rather short period of time, basically from the end of the Civil War, basically from 1865, 66, basically to the middle 1880s. So basically a period of about 20 years or so. And they ended for a number of different reasons. First of all, especially in the 1880s, you had a series of back-to-back really bad winters on the plains, and it killed a large number of cows. But also, you had the barbed wire that was invented during this time period. Before barbed wire, it was very hard to fence in your ranch or farm. Wood, of course, is very scarce on the plains. Of course, in the east, we have large forests where you have lots of wood. But to transport that wood out west in large amounts would make it very expensive. So to fence in a farm, especially if you had a large farm, thousands of acres, for example, would be cost prohibitive. It would be very, very expensive. But then comes the barbed wire. Invented by Mr. Giddens. The barbed wire was extremely cheap, and it didn't. You didn't actually have to, like a fence, every inch of ground, you didn't have to have something, a big fence, a slat of wood going from the ground up. Basically, of course, you had barbed wire going from fence post to fence post, and you didn't have to have many strands of barbed wire. Oftentimes, one strand of barbed wire would do, although oftentimes two strands were used, and later on, sometimes even 3 strands as the price decreased. Of course, once you fenced in those farms, once you fenced in the ranches, it's going to be very hard to drive your cows through that fencing. And later, as we'll see, sometimes that actually led to fighting between the cattle drivers and the owners of the land who wanted to protect their land from the cows, especially if you had a farm, the thousands of cows basically trampling down your crops and eating your food. Is one reason why you fenced in your farm in the first place. And so if someone cut that fence and allowed the cows in, obviously you're not going to be a very happy owner or a very happy farmer, and you might respond with gunfire, and the other side might respond to gunfires back, which created the range wars, which are also very popular on TV movies. Then the railroads, which apparently I can't spell railroads on this, were also coming to Texas by the 1880s. Of course, that one basically railroad that ran through Kansas, that basically was started after the Civil War, served for a number of years, but by the middle of the 1880s, railroads had penetrated into Texas, and so it didn't make much sense if you were going to load your cows in a railroad car to actually drive them by foot from Texas to Kansas and put on a railroad car. We can, simply drive them a few miles, or drive them. I don't mean drive like a car. What I mean is walk them, herd them a few miles to where there's a road line in Texas, and put them on those railroad cars and ship them up to the East Coast for food. But besides that, you also had, during this time period, the 1880s, you had the introduction of refrigeration techniques on the road cars themselves. And with the refrigeration, that means that you did not have to have live meat. You didn't have to have live cows being shipped to New York and then killing them and then eating the meat before it spoiled. With refrigeration, you could kill the cows here in Texas and pack the meat on the refrigerated railroad cars and then ship that meat to New York City, and it'd still be edible for those people. So for all those reasons, the cattle drives basically ended here. The major cattle drives actually ended in the mid 1880s. Of course, helping with these cattle drives was the destruction of the buffalo herds, and of course the Indian reservation system, because the Indian reservation system, in order to keep the Indians on the reservation, the U.S. government sponsored basically the extermination of large amounts of the buffalo herds. So the Indians will not leave the reservations going buffalo hunting. And obviously, if you don't have buffaloes to go hunt, that's one less reason you have to leave the reservation if you're an Indian. And of course the buffalo themselves had eaten the grass on the Great Plains and trampled areas. So obviously, if you're a farmer on the Great Plains, you're not too sad to see the buffalo go, because like cows, they would trample your food and eat your food that you had spent large number of months trying to grow to make a living on the western frontier. So you had all this land basically opening up, especially the grazing land for the cows. So ranches in Texas became larger and larger. Eventually, for example, the King Ranch in South Texas covered about 1,300 square miles, in over 4 counties. It was not the largest ranch in Texas, however. That would be in the Panhandle, the XIT Ranch, which had about 3 million acres of land. The state of Texas basically traded that land for cash, for money, from a group of investors from the east who wanted a large cattle ranch, and the state of Texas authorized that land to be sold to them, and in exchange, the investors then basically gave the state money to build the state capitol building in Austin, Texas. Of course, there were other animals sharing the grazing land, especially after the buffalo, but besides the cows, and that included sheep. Sheep were introduced here in Texas. Of course, you can share the sheep of their wool and sell the wool. And sheep ranchers felt that they should be able to share the land with cattle ranchers and farmers as well. However, again, as barbed wire becomes available, sheep ranchers start to, of course, fence in their land, because again, the sheep graze on the same sort of grass the cows graze on. And so if you have an introduction of sheep in the area, pretty soon your grazing land for the cows is gone. So the ranchers didn't like that, especially didn't like it when that land was enclosed by barbed wire, which means they couldn't hold their cattle drives. And again, these basically started range wars. Fence cutting became, eventually, in order to try to stop these range wars and try to stop people from shooting each other over cutting fencing, fence cutting became a felony. It became a very serious criminal offense here in Texas. And the Texas Rangers, who have had a number of different roles in Texas, also became sort of the guardians of and one of the protectors of fencing, and tried to stop fence wars by basically arresting people who were cutting the fence, because again, once you cut the fence, then the cows were going to come in, and then there was going to be somebody mad, and somebody starts shooting, and the other side starts shooting, and pretty soon you have a lot of people dead. And so the state felt that by basically arresting a person cutting the fence and giving them a pretty stiff prison sentence, that would tamp down, that would prevent these range wars that had been occurring not just in Texas, but also in the Great Plains as well. But again, the cattle industry had its heyday in those basically 20 years after the Civil War. But again, many different things sort of worked together to end that period of time, which is again immortalized on film for everyone to enjoy. The barbed wire certainly was a factor. Refrigeration of railroad cars certainly was a factor, but so was overgrazing. When you have a lot of cows and the plains growing that grass, there's only so much grass, only so much food for so many cows, and again, when you're sharing that land with sheep, and other animals, then pretty soon there's not enough grass for all the animals, and pretty soon the animals start to die off on their own. But again, in the mid-1880s, you had a couple of back-to-back blizzards that killed a large percentage of cows that were on the Great Plains. A little less, of course, here in South Texas and Central Texas, but certainly in the northern Panhandle area, which is part of the Great Plains, and especially in the Great Plains and the rest part of the United States, these blizzards really affected the cattle industry. And then following the blizzards were some droughts, which means the rain didn't fall, which means the grass was not growing very well on the plains, which means, again, you didn't have any food for the animals. So all of that led to decline in the cattle industry by certainly by the late 1880s. Of course, here in Texas, besides cattle ranching and cattle, you also had farming that was very important. Especially, however, on the plains, you had to have, there's oftentimes not as much rainfall as in Central and South Texas, which means you have to have special farming techniques called dry farming, which basically means you plow really, really deep into the ground and leave some basically dirt on top of the ground. So when the water comes, the water is basically caught and it goes into the little ditch that you dug to grow your crops. Farmers also use crop rotation, that is, certain crops suck nutrients out of the ground, and if you plant those crops like 4 or 5 years in a row, pretty soon there are no more nutrients in the ground to suck up and the crops won't grow there anymore. So if you're growing those types of crops, if you rotate them every 2 or 3 years to a different place, that gives the original area time to replenish itself, especially if you plant other crops that actually put those nutrients back into the ground. So farmers would often have different sections of the field growing different crops at different times of the year in order to keep the farm productive. And then, of course, you had windmills. Of course, windmills are nothing more than water pumping machines. Of course, they look very nice going round and round and round, but their main job, the main job of the windmill going round and round and round, is so that the gears inside, as they go round and round, they basically pump water from the ground, deep, deep underground. So if you lack rainfall, you can probably find a deep aquifer, a deep sort of underground river somewhere, and you can pump water from there. And those were especially helpful for crops in West Texas and the Panhandle, especially. So those dry farming techniques were pretty important to keep the Texas farms going during this time period. Texas farms grew many crops. Among the most important were wheat and rice, sorghum that they also grew, but that was more of for feeding cows and pigs and other animals. But for human production, wheat and rice, especially along the Texas Gulf Coast, wheat further inland. Sugarcane was a pretty big money maker, again, grown especially along the Texas coast, and cotton, pretty important money maker as well for Texas. Eventually by 1900, in that year, I think like 3.5 million bales of cotton were grown here in Texas and shipped. So of course the cotton was used to make clothing and other things like that. So these were especially big money makers in the state of Texas, and to grow that cotton and some of these other crops, you needed workers. And as I've already mentioned before, many of the former slaves, once they become free people, they need a job. And the former master of the land, still owning the land, they need workers. And so you put the former the people that need the jobs together with the person that needs workers, and you can produce money. However, at the time, of course, the people that owned the land didn't have money to actually pay the workers, and that's where the sharecropping system began. So basically, as a sharecropper, you basically worked on somebody else's land. That is, you rented the land from them, and because you didn't have any money to pay them, you paid them back with a share of your crop, like the share of your cotton crop. 50% was probably the usual amount. However, of course, if you needed to borrow other things to make the cotton crop, if you needed to borrow seeds or tools or wagons to move your cotton crop, or to borrow a cotton gin to clean the cotton crop, all those would be added on to the rent that you owed. So eventually, you could owe a very large percentage of your cotton crop to the owner of the land. And especially in bad years, especially if there are a couple of bad years in a row, that means that you'd be heavily in debt eventually, and you'd probably not be working your way out of that debt, and you'd probably leave that debt for your kids to work on, and maybe even your grandkids to work on. But if you became a sort of a successful sharecropper, you might actually become a tenant farmer, where basically you sort of paid your rent with money. And then maybe if you were successful at that, you might actually become a landowner. And as a landowner, you could, again, rent the land to sharecroppers and take part of their crops, or to tenants where they would actually pay you money. But having said that, by 1930, less than half of farmers, only 40% of farmers own their own farm. So even by as late as 1930, even really even as late as the start of World War II, you had a very large percentage of Texans who were basically sharecroppers or tenants that did not own their own land as far as farming was concerned. So good and bad things about Texas after the American Civil War. Of course, Texans were making money off cattle drives, but again, the cattle drives themselves created problems, and eventually those cattle drives came to an end by the turn of the century. Then, of course, you had sheep grazers, again, helping to make money, but also creating problems. Then, of course, you had farmers who had problems to begin with in trying to till the soil, which was oftentimes dry, and sometimes there wasn't enough rain, and sometimes that led to drought. Of course, they used special techniques to try to overcome that and grow crops, and eventually they were successful in growing things like wheat and rice, and especially sugarcane along the coast, and cotton, which became the really big item as well. So having said that, after the Civil War, Texas was growing economically. It was also growing in population, I think from about 600,000 to about 3 million by the turn of the century. And at least people had jobs. The jobs sometimes did not pay very much, and sometimes you were sort of stuck at that job for the rest of your life, and sometimes your kids would sort of have to pay off your debt, but at least you weren't starving, at least you weren't dying in a war, and at least things were getting better as far as Texas after the Civil War. Also, increased farming led to more towns, and those towns then were connected by the railroads. And so besides Texans having jobs, Texans were also becoming more urban. That is, more and more were starting to live in cities as opposed to living in the rural areas or on farms or on ranches. More and more were moving to the towns, and more were moving to the cities, and those cities and towns were connected by railroads, and then, of course, by the telegraph system, and then by the early 1900s, the telephone system. And so in that 40-year period from 1860 to 1900, really the 35-year period from the years after the Civil War, 1900, Texas was growing economically. It was also growing in population, and things were getting better.